People who work in British Columbia's Parliament buildings, who might sometimes have to work late, say that occasionally they see a strange sight in the distance coming down these long corridors. It's a man. At first they don't pay much attention until he approaches them, and then they realize he's a tall man, quite thin, and as he gets closer they realize he's quite handsome, sporting a thin mustache with dark wavy hair. But he's wearing a coat that is a little different from a suit coat today. It's a frock coat, the sort of coat a man would wear in the 1890s. They blink, and then he's gone. Did they see him to begin with? Of course, they're working late. Maybe they're working too late. Maybe it's their vivid imagination. They try not to think about it, but they've heard that other people have seen the same man. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, whether they believe in ghosts, people who come to these buildings know that the inspiration, the spirit of the architect who designed them is all around. His name is Francis Mawson Rattenbury. And in his day, and probably even to this day, he really is the most famous architect of all times in British Columbia. He started off not here, but in Yorkshire in England. His mother's maiden name was Mawson. That's where Rattenbury's middle name came from. Two of her brothers were architects, and they practiced together in Bradford. But when he was 25 years old, he decided maybe it was time to branch out on his own, to find greener pastures. And what better place to go than Vancouver? The Canadian Pacific Railway had reached there in 1886. The town had promptly burned down. It was being rebuilt. And so in 1892, when Rattenbury arrived, there was still lots of work for the building city. He published a notice in the newspaper to say that he'd arrived and would welcome any job that people gave him. But the very same day, in fact on the very same page in that newspaper, there was a notice from the British Columbia government. Notice to architects. The government wanted to build new Parliament buildings in Victoria to replace the old buildings, the buildings that were sometimes known as the bird cages, a rather quaint pair of old brick buildings that stood, well, right beside the harbor. They needed replacing. Rattenbury thought it was a long shot, but why not? He sent in some plans, and he was shortlisted. He was one of a handful of people who were asked to work up bigger plans. And early in 1893, he received a telegram to tell him he had won. This man, barely 25, just arrived in Canada, was now the architect of British Columbia's most famous building. And from that, his fame continued to grow. Trained, yes, but experienced, no. Rattenbury was really caught off guard in some ways, and he was working feverishly to finish the plans as the construction of the Parliament buildings began, and he was just one step ahead the whole way. Inevitably, there were changes as he saw what was taking place, and when he saw that perhaps there was a better way of doing something. When the buildings were finished in 1898, and the tally was made of the costs, what should have cost $600,000 turned out to cost closer to $1 million, a huge cost overrun at that time. However, there were detractors, rival architects perhaps, sour grapes, some people say, but they criticized him for having liberally borrowed plans from his old firm in Yorkshire, and many other things like that, but it all seemed to be like water off a duck's back to Rattenbury, and pretty soon he was designing the Bank of Montreal. The government picked him up again to design courthouses in Nelson and Vancouver and other places. And most notably, the Canadian Pacific Railway invited him to design big railway hotels up in the mountains, and the Empress Hotel here in Victoria, which opened in 1908. Some say it might even be his finest work. Rattenbury's most accomplished work took place during the early half of his career. Rattenbury may have had an astounding career as an architect, but he also got involved in community life. He was the mayor, or reeve, of Oak Bay at one point, but his personal life left a lot to be desired. He had married a woman by the name of Florrie, and together they'd had 2 children, Frank and Mary. At first it seemed it was a happy marriage, but after a while it clearly was not. And in the 1920s, Rattenbury had an affair with a woman by the name of Alma Pakenham. A small affair at first, and then everybody in town seemed to know about it except Florrie. Eventually, Florrie was forced out of their house, and she built a house nearby and then died, having filed for divorce. As soon as the divorce was granted, Rattenbury married Alma. And in Victoria, in the 1920s, this was scandalous. People that had known him would cross the street when they saw him coming. They snubbed him and his wife, and eventually, as he was getting old enough to retire, he decided that enough was enough. They would move to England. They would start a new life where nobody would know them. And so they settled in Bournemouth. But Rattenbury was retired. It wasn't working out, however, because he became depressed. He had always craved recognition. He had a huge ego. And in Bournemouth, there was nobody to stroke his ego. He began to drink too much, and many evenings he was asleep in his chair by the fire. Alma, who was only half his age, and this was part of the scandal, craved a little bit more excitement in her life. They had a chauffeur. His name was George Stoner. He was only 18 years old, but very handsome. And perhaps inevitably, Alma and George Stoner began going for long drives in the countryside every day that seemingly got longer and longer. The old man figured out what was going on, and George knew this, and one night the old man was asleep. George crept in with a croquet mallet, and in Rattenbury's own library at his home, the croquet mallet came down across the old man's skull, and that was it. Rattenbury was soon dead. Alma confessed and said she had done it. But when the trial took place in the Old Bailey courthouse in London, it was quite clear that she had not done it. George had, and he was sentenced to be hanged. Alma had lost her husband. Now she was about to lose her boyfriend. She couldn't live without him. And she stood near a bridge. She plunged a knife into her heart and fell into the water. She was buried, not beside, but near her husband, in the same cemetery. But neither grave was marked. It seems the family did not want any publicity about this sordid affair. If Alma had waited, George was not hanged. He was given a life sentence. And during World War II, he was let out to fight. Rattenbury's grave in the Bournemouth Cemetery lay unmarked for many, many years, a lonely spot. I had a chance to visit it once myself. It took a while before one of the caretakers was able to point out where it was. But a good Samaritan from Victoria, just a few years ago, decided it was time. And so, with permission from the son that was born of Alma and Rattenbury, a boy who grew up into a man, his name is John, and became an architect in Arizona, he said yes, it was about time. And so the stone was finally placed on the grave of Francis Mawson Rattenbury, the person who probably is still considered one of British Columbia's most famous architects.